is now in session. Commissioner Andrews.
Present.
Commissioner Rennie.
Here.
Commissioner Herr is excused, as is Commissioner Studley. First off, any public comment on matters appearing on the agenda or not appearing on the agenda at this time?
Yes, good afternoon, Commissioners and Director St. Croix. My name is Dr. Derek Kerr. I'm a whistleblower. You are violating the city charter, specifically Article 4 of the Campaign and Governmental Conduct Code. It's also known as the Whistleblower Protection Ordinance. You are mandated to annually report 4 things. 1, the number of complaints received. 2, the types of conduct complained about. 3, the number of complaints that you refer out to other agencies. 4, the number of investigations you conduct. This assures the public that complaints coming in are matched by the complaints going out. You haven't done this since 2005. Your annual reports only note the number of cases, quote, resolved, unquote, not investigated. The Director's monthly report deleted all of this data in 2011. Now the public has no idea how many complaints are coming in, how many go out, and how many are buried in between. Since you are responsible for reviewing claims of whistleblower retaliation, retaliation should be listed as a type of conduct complained about. But it isn't. You are violating Article 4. Please pay attention to this. Thank you for listening. Here's my statement for the minutes.
Thank you, Dr. Kerr.
Commissioners, Ray Hartz, Director, San Francisco Open Government. Just waiting for the clock to reset still. You guys like to quote the Good Government Guide to us, and so I'd like to quote a little bit of it back to you. Quasi-judicial bodies must afford a fair hearing to the parties before them. Central to a fair hearing is the principle that decision-makers come to the meeting with an open mind, prepared to hear both sides and to decide the case on the merits of the evidence presented and the governing law. In February and May, I had 2 complaints that came before you against Luis Herrera, the city librarian. A conflict of interest is a set of circumstances that creates a risk that professional judgment or actions regarding a primary interest will be unduly influenced by a secondary interest, including the duties of public office. It exists if the circumstances are reasonably believed on the basis of past experience and objective evidence to create a risk that decisions may be unduly influenced by secondary risks. So when the Sunshine Ordinance Task Force found City Librarian Luis Herrera in violation of the Sunshine Ordinance twice for the same matter, they had no conflict. They reviewed the law, they reviewed the evidence, and they found him in violation. Now, when they referred those to you here at Ethics for enforcement, I guess they didn't think about the third case, which was against your executive director, Mr. St. Croix, for the exact same reason, based on the exact same facts, with the exact same finding. Finding Luis Herrera in violation would have been detrimental to the interests of this body, and you know it. With 3 of the 5 members being attorneys, I have continued to wonder if you considered whether you could be impartial in those 2 cases. I said this at the time. There was 6 findings on the same subject. Mr. St. Croix was referred for the same violations. They violated my rights and the rights of other citizens of San Francisco for a period of more than 2 years. By abrogating and censoring our public comments. and preventing them to show up in the minutes. And yet, you guys didn't seem to have any problem knowing that you had a case against your own executive director, finding Mr. Herrera not in violation without looking at the facts and without reviewing the law. You did neither. And I pointed that out in my case because your investigators only looked at what they wanted to look at to let Mr. St. Croix off the hook and give you an out. Who will watch the watchman?
Any further public comment on matters appearing on the agenda or not appearing on the agenda? Okay. The first order of business will be discussion and possible action on a request for a waiver from the Campaign and Governmental Conduct Code, Section 3.222. Mr. Cass Smith is an architect who occupies one of 2 architect seats on the Arts Commission and has requested the waiver. Mr. St. Croix, do you want to enlighten us on this?
The details of the case are laid out in the staff memo, and Mr. Cass is here to answer any questions you might have about his application.
Mr. Smith?
Hello, I'm Cass. We've spoken before. Hi. Do you want me to cover sort of my position on it at all?
I think that would be appreciated.
Okay. So just to clarify a few things, my name is Cass Smith. I'm, as you say, one of the 2 architects on the Arts Commission, and I'm the one architect on there's 2 architects also on the Civic Design Review Committee, where we review all of the exterior architecture of any building on public property, which ranges from hetchy pump stations to parks and recs, landscaping, libraries, any building basically, SF General Hospital. And there's Leo Chow from Skidmore, Owens & Merrill is on the commission and on the Civic Design Review Committee, but I chair that and have for 4 years. I was appointed during the Newsom campaign and then just took my oath under Mayor Lee. So anyhow, my firm, CCS Architecture, it's a 15-person firm. I've been practicing architecture in San Francisco for about 25 years. I grew up in the Bay Area. I went to UC Berkeley. Most of my staff lives here, too. So what I'm asking for, well, one thing I've noticed being on the committee is the way, is the variety and number of projects that are put forth for our review and how they're designed. And I've seen through my kind of vision of, it's kind of my vision of a public servant on the committee as well as an architect who's interested in kind of improving the built environment, that it could be a win-win situation if my firm were not in a conflict of interest to design certain projects that I would be asked to work on, or sometimes it would just be consulting. I don't think it's very many. I don't think it's the large ones, and who knows if it will, if it would even materialize. There's RFQ processes and RFP processes. The city has a pretty good staff of architects in what used to be the Bureau of Architecture. Now it's called Building Development, or Building and BCD, Building and Construction Department. And then there's also private architects who are on short list. So basically what I'm requesting is that if the waiver is granted, my firm would be on the sort of approved or one of the lists that could be solicited, and then I would have anybody in my firm other than myself manage it. Also, I'd like to say I'm a 75% owner, so I know I'm above I think it's the 20% threshold, so I'm way above that. And then, of course, I would recuse myself on the commission from voting on any of those projects. So I look at it as a win-win. You get a very dedicated, skilled architect on some projects, plus you get me on the Civic Design Review Committee reviewing projects as well. I totally understand if that looks like a conflict of interest and you can't grant that waiver. I get it. So that's my request today.
Thank you. Commissioners, any questions or comments on this?
Yeah, I have a couple questions, Mr. Smith. As I understand it from your letter, you have already served 4 years in this role on the Arts Commission. Is that correct?
I have,
And
roughly 4, something like that, yeah. I think I'm just
And,
starting my 4th.
the waiver you're asking for would relate to reappointment by Mayor Lee to that position. Is that correct?
Right, I was just reappointed and confirmed.
What?
So it would relate to projects into the future under that current,
Right. But in the past 4 years, you didn't ask for a waiver from the ordinance that
correct,
precluded you from presenting things, correct?
correct, yes.
Because what concerns me, and we get a number of these, is I agree and I think appreciate your willingness to serve the public, because you are performing a fairly important role, and that commission requires 2 architects to be on it. But I'm troubled by our sort of routinely granting a waiver when there's no showing by the mayor that he can't find somebody else to appoint to it who is prepared to perform as you did in the first 4 years without seeking a waiver. And I guess my question is, why you feel a need to continue on, because I take it you won't accept it without the waiver. Is that correct?
No, that's actually not true. I would, with or without the waiver, doesn't influence my decision whether to stay on the commission or not. I've always been, I'm on the commission until I decide to do something else or whatever. I really enjoy it. I think we have, I was actually kind of surprised when I joined the commission. I didn't even understand there was a CDR, and I was very surprised at how much positive impact we could have.
Now, in your letter, you talk about recusing yourself from reviewing and voting on projects put forth to the Civic Design Review Committee. Those are projects where your firm would be putting forth, not to all projects.
Correct. Just those ones specifically. Correct. Yeah. And the interesting technicality that I don't completely understand, but I think John St. Croix pointed out, is that the waiver, not that it would be granted, but can be granted if the charter of the Arts Commission requires 2 architects to be on it, which I thought sounded interesting, and I kind of assumed that it didn't require that. But then I checked with Sharon, and it does, actually. It is within the charter. So.
But that is one of the exceptions.
Or one of the reasons.
That allows it, if the commission, for example, the historic preservation, there's only one architect that has to be on it.
Right. So it fits within that. That might be a small thing, but I was just bringing that up again because it was interesting. Yeah.
Mr. St. Croix, I have a question, it's a little fuzzy in my mind. So on the waivers apply to the individual only, or to the individual and the firm which that individual represents? And by the same token, the reverse of that, is that how it applies in terms of if that firm is applying for a contract with the city?
Well, because the gentleman is a major principal, it applies to the firm.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
I could sell my shares and go down to 19%. For the record, no.
It sounds as if you really place a very high value on your commission seat.
I do. It's an honor. I think there's 5 of us on the Civic Design Review. I think, we get along very well. I think we're very productive, and it's surprisingly, it's one of those things where you really feel like you're doing something. I think even, paid employees of cities or in politics, sometimes people probably feel like, God, what do I do with impact or something, And we sit around and we go, wow, we really gave some good advice to that architect or to that agency, and they listened and they made the changes, and wow, look how much. I mean, one of these days I want to kind of do one of these before and afters, because we get beat up sometimes by the mayor's office because we're not approving projects fast enough. Going off tangent a little bit, I'd like to say, look at the difference. Anyhow.
Commissioner Andrews?
Thank you. Mr. Smith, I wanted to hear a little bit more about your thought process. And I would, if we could, hear your thought process starting all the way back to 4 years ago. What amount of knowledge you had around this ordinance that was ultimately would preclude you from responding to any RFQ or RFP. And was it a consideration 4 years ago? And around the timing of it for now, were you knowledgeable of it while you considered yourself and in the deliberation of putting yourself forward for another 4 years? First of all, thank you for your service for the last 4 years. And in the deliberation of it, was the fullness of the deliberation this particular piece of it as well? So I guess the question is why now? What happened the first 4 years, and was it a consideration then? Were you knowledgeable of it, and when did you become knowledgeable of it, and then how did that weigh into your deliberations to stay on the commission?
Right. Well, in the very beginning, I didn't even think about it because I didn't even know there was civic design review. I had no idea, actually. I never, because I didn't know. I thought we would be reviewing art and murals, and I didn't. I was sort of, I just didn't know. But then I was, given the chairmanship of the civic design review, and then I think I just over time watched the way projects got designed and managed, and you sit there and you think about it. Sometimes you go, that's the kind of project my firm would do, and sometimes you think, wow, they're doing a really good job, and that's great. And I must say, when you see them being done in ways that you think your firm could do better, it makes you, I think, that might have been maybe 2 years into it. And then so you just kind of scratch your head a little bit. And then I don't really think, at that point, honestly, I didn't really think about, well, would I want to? Should I? It was just kind of more of almost a rhetorical question back to myself. And then after a while, it started to maybe ring a little bit. I said, I think projects could be done. Some of these, if given the opportunity, could be done at a higher level, at a better level. Who knows? I might crash and burn on a project. I might hit one out of the park. But that's generally the way I've seen it. And I think I come to it with just kind of a broad design advocate in general. Like, if you look at the way the Dutch do it, and there's just such a dedication to high-power design, good design, and I don't know, maybe it's setting examples sometimes. I mean, on the committee, sometimes we kind of get frustrated because we feel like the bar isn't being set high enough sometimes. And there's no reason it shouldn't, because we're a world-class city. The projects are well-funded. There's nothing, there's not like something that's making them, like, there's many projects that just will never be good no matter what. And there's a lot of these city projects, I think, that could be really, really good. And so I felt like I could actually have not just a positive impact one way, but the other. I mean, I've got a lot of theories about it. I think projects should go out for competitions more. None of that's really relevant, but I think there are other methods besides what I'm talking about today that could raise the bar too.
Can I do a quick follow-up?
Yes, certainly.
So if I could narrow the timeline, so I'm believing that probably in the last 2 or 3 months, all of this, you were knowledgeable of all this. You gave thought to a second term in which that came out as an affirmative for yourself and for Mayor Lee. But you were fully knowledgeable of this as well. Did you have this conversation with yourself, and did you have this conversation with folks in your firm enough to say you ultimately would be weighing the two, right? So you were knowledgeable of both of these. If I step forward and go for another four-year term, this preclusion still is there, and I'm going to hedge my bets and hope for the best, and then go to the commission. I was just wondering how you ultimately got there over a period of, and I'm guessing it was probably in the last couple of months that all of this just
I
came
never
to a head.
I really never, because I enjoy being on the commission a lot. I never. I mean, I know what you're asking, but I never really sat down with myself and said, make a decision. Which one do you want? I never did. I mean, I know for a fact that if I weren't on the commission and there was no conflict of interest, I know I would probably be quite assertive in trying to get certain work, because you'd sort of be an idiot not to. But I never felt like that was a trade-off at this point, and I don't see that becoming a trade-off. I have a lot of work. I don't need to make more money. My life is very interesting. It works pretty well, and I really like the balance that being on the commission gives me. It's a different world of design and all that, and I don't think I would trade that for just a few more projects. It just doesn't fit into my big picture, right? So, and what I did originally, and it was probably more than 3 months ago, it might have been 6 months ago, but I was just kind of curious about it. I didn't even know, frankly, that there was a conflict of interest. I figured there was, but I never got out the charter and read. But I checked with Vicki, who used to be staff, and I said, hey, what's up? Is this a conflict of interest if I were to work on some of these projects? It's actually when some of the fire stations started coming through. I was like, those are. I felt like I just had like a little extra interest in fire stations when I saw the way they were coming through and what they could have been and weren't quite getting there. And I checked, and she said, check with the city attorney's office. So I did that, and actually the initial information was it wasn't a conflict of interest. I was like, okay, and then I was like, I'm not so sure about that. I wanted to be really safe, and then I checked with John, and he said no, there would, and then so we went through this, and then I wrote the letter. But yeah. I mean, believe me, it's not a threat to, like, give me the waiver, I'm leaving, and I never thought about it that way either.
Well, I too would like to thank you for your service on the commission. It sounds as if you are fully engaged and enjoy it very much, and I think that makes a big difference. I would dare venture that being the chair of the Civic Design Review Committee in some ways is a competitive advantage for you as an architect, because you are aware of a lot of projects and the process and the procedures necessary for any firm that is involved in these things. So to some extent you already have an advantage. But what I'd like to do now is to open it up to any comments from the public.
Yeah, sounds good.
Thank you.
Commissioners, Ray Hartz, Director, San Francisco Open Government. As you probably have figured out, I go to a lot of boards and commissions. And I'd like to talk about an incident since the requester of the waiver brought the issue up of being appointed and serving on the on the Arts Commission and so forth, of the fact that really does mean that he took an oath of office to support and defend the Constitution of the United States and that of the state of California. He has been through the Sunshine Ordinance Task Force, Sunshine Ordinance training at least 3 times, signed at least 3 affidavits, it may be more by this time. And yet, and this is a matter of public record, at a public meeting of the Arts Commission, Mr. Peter Warfield, Executive Director of the Library Users Association, got up to make some very innocuous comments about the fact that they were failing to follow the Sunshine Ordinance. And while I know that under the ordinance, members of boards and commissions are allowed to respond, they are not allowed to be abusive. And I would say that the comments that Mr. Smith made to Mr. Warfield were abusive. And I would suggest you go back and review those comments. One of the comments was, I don't have to listen to this shit from someone like you, excuse me. And then he referred to Mr. Warfield as Mr. Whoever you are. And then he finally came out at the end and said, I'm going to do what I can to make sure you're not involved in things like this anymore, which I took as a clear threat to say, I'm not going to let you participate in public comment. Now, when you have someone who takes an oath, takes the training multiple times, signs a number of agreements to follow that training and follow that law, how can you trust that person to be a good-willed person who is going to actually recuse himself in cases where he should? I have real questions about it, and I think you should go back and review the testimony. It's public record. You can go and look at the Arts Commission and hear Mr. Calder-Smith say what he said, and there were more things. I just didn't bring my notes with me tonight. Now, the thing about this is, while he was good enough to do this in public and insult Mr. Warfield on a number of points in public, he has at no time ever apologized to Mr. Warfield, let alone in public, for having abused his position as a member of the Arts Commission. And as a result, I don't feel he deserves to be on the Arts Commission. I question why he is still on the Arts Commission, because the only thing I've gotten from the executive director, Mr. Tom DeCaney, is that they talked to him. I don't think they would have had to talk to him to have him know that he's not allowed to be abusive to someone who is getting up and making legitimate public comments. And I certainly don't think anybody who would do that in public and yet fail to apologize in public lacks a certain level of integrity.
Any further public comment on this matter? If not, commissioners, any further questions or comments?
Well, I just wanted, and for those who are more experienced with this, I see that we write, at least for the staff, says that we've never taken this particular waiver up. Is that correct?
Yes.
The specific one. And then as I read the waiver, it says the Ethics Commission may waive in this section for any officer who by law must be appointed to represent as in a profession. So it falls within, it seems to me that for as much as I have an understanding of it, it falls squarely within it. And as we talk about it, I would want to hear reasons why we would, and then reasons why we would. Is there something extraordinary that we're missing here that keeps us from taking this under full consideration, or if we need other information on it? Because it seems like in reading through the ordinance itself and reading through the waiver and in reading through the requirement for the Arts Commission having two professionals on there, and with Mr. Smith holding one of those positions, I was wondering if how close or less close this is to one of a garden variety request this would be, or how exceptional this request is, since we haven't picked it up.
Well, in general, waiver requests are post-employment, and the city officials, city officers are enjoined from certain kinds of contacts and activities with the city for a year after they leave. So when waiver requests generally come to this, someone wants to demonstrate that they want to participate in a prohibited activity and then say, well, but there's not a conflict of interest, so I should be allowed to do it. Mm-hmm. Some of those requests have been not denied. Most of them have been approved. We very seldom get requests, and again, within this particular type of waiver, we've never had this request, where people want to remain as part of the city board, commission, staff, whatever, and conduct what would normally be considered a conflict of interest activity.
I have no further comments except to say that my position on this and decision I make will be without regard to the accusations that have been lodged against Mr. Smith, which I do not think are appropriately before us. But I've got to say I maybe wish there were more people here, but I'm inclined to deny the waiver. under these circumstances, I think absent a showing that that position couldn't be filled without somebody asking for a waiver, I'm not disposed. The voters said they wanted this provision, and I don't see a reason to waive it.
My own view is that to answer your question, Commissioner Andrews, at least during my tenure, we have not addressed this kind of request. And as Mr. St. Croix said, most of the requests are of people who are leaving a commission. And in those cases, I have tended to feel that I do not want to deprive people who have left city government or city positions of further professional opportunities. And these professional opportunities are not that common, and you don't want to unduly limit the chances that such individuals have. But I do think that as a commissioner, I think it would send the wrong message. I think the whole point of being on a commission is to weigh in on the activities of city government and what we do. And I think to say, as a commissioner, then you're now going to also be recruiting business, I think sends the wrong message, the wrong perception to the public. So I would be inclined to deny the request as well in this case. And I'm really, and I do have to say, as I said earlier to you, Mr. Smith, it seems as if you are doing quite a good job and seem to enjoy it. And and then the Art Commission is lucky to have you in that position with your expertise. And I do believe that just in a less formal way, you do have a little bit of a competitive advantage knowing what you do and the kind of decisions that you're making and what you've learned that can be applied within your profession. If you were forced to make a choice, I suppose, then you will make that choice, whether to stay on the commission or to leave the commission and then try to get your firm to get city contracts. But I think that, as I said before, it's the wrong message that I at least would want to send to the public in this particular situation.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with you, Commissioners. I wasn't completely clear or completely persuaded that it seemed like it was an interest. I probably would be more compelled if it were a financial hardship, and that's where I was sort of heading. You said you're doing fine. You're doing a great job on the commission. Your firm is doing well. But if it turned out that the majority of the projects that were coming online over the next year were out of 100% of them, 75% of them, your firm would be eligible for, and you were already experiencing financial hardship, I would take a little bit more consideration to that. But it seems I wasn't sufficiently convinced that really it was. It feels more like a luxury decision than it is an essential decision for yourself. And you'll have an opportunity to make that decision at some point on the commission.
I would like to add to Commissioner Rennie's comments about Mr. Hart's comments. I don't know that they're completely germane to the question before us. The only thing I would say, and I don't excuse any commissioner that mistreats or a member of the public who has something to say or brings something to our attention or to the attention of any commission, but as an aside, I would just say, particularly sometimes with newer commissioners, commissioners are people, and they're human, all too human at times, and sometimes they can lose sight of the official role that they have to play. That does not excuse those kinds of comments or behavior, and certainly apologies may very well be in order, but I would just, like to say that, just put it on the record in terms of those of us who are commissioners and can sometimes get a little frustrated, as I'm sure the public becomes frustrated with us, so there you have it. So I will call the question.
Well, we don't have a motion. I
we
don't think you need one.
We
at
don't
this
need one?
point, no.
Since there are only three of us?
Well,
Or even so, we don't need one?
I mean, the outcome is certain.
Okay, all right.
So
I'll make a motion that we deny the request.
you can do that.
I second.
All in favor?
Public comment.
Oh, public comment. Always public comment? Hearing none? All in favor?
Aye.
Thanks. I
Motion passes.
staying on. I appreciate it.
Can I make some comments like that?
Okay, the next item up on the agenda is discussion and possible action on policies related to the handling of violations of certain provisions of the Campaign Finance Reform Ordinance, otherwise known as CFRO, Campaign and Governmental Conduct Code, Section 1.100. Staff report on this?
So we're following up both on an old policy decision and on some recent discussions about moving settlement actions and penalties to the Enforcement Division from the audit staff. So in order to set up a process for handling these, the enforcement staff has developed some guidelines that they propose to use when making enforcement penalties to those people who have violated this section of the law. And much like when we have late fines for other filings that the campaign finance staff handles, we have a set of criteria when people request a waiver of either a full or partial waiver from the penalties, the late fines assigned to them. We have some criteria for mitigating factors where they can get reductions. This is very similar. The list is not identical, but it tracks that in some ways. So we have factors in mitigation and factors in aggravation that we'd like to use. The initial penalty for making a contribution larger than the law allows is 100% of the excess contribution. And again, based on whatever the criteria there are, bookkeeping and whatever mistakes are made, whether this is deliberate, we want to set in basically an advanced set of guidelines for the staff to use.
Reading the staff's report, it was unclear back in 2008 when this was first discussed. Have we been imposing forfeitures where there was a contribution that exceeded the limit?
Well, yes, forfeitures. We've been collecting forfeitures all along. Okay. But it was a question of when we would do occasional reviews of how enforcement was working. In the early stage of my tenure, we only had one enforcement staffer. And it wasn't until years later that we were able to gain additional staff. For a while we had two, and then ultimately we had four, and now we have two again. So for various reasons, we delayed moving the collection of these enforcement penalties against excess contributions, stayed with the audit staff, because generally they're found as a result of an audit. And so part of the audit report would say, you have X number of contributions over the limit, you have to forfeit that excess to the city. There was not a formal process for considering waivers for those assessments.
There was not a process to enforce that, you say, to collect it actually?
Well, no, I mean, when somebody owes money, after 3 months, we're supposed to refer it to the Bureau of Delinquent Revenues.
Okay.
But there wasn't a process to consider, if somebody was assessed, say, $3,000 in excess contributions, they would have to just give that $3,000 to the city. There wasn't a formal process for giving them a waiver of all or part of that amount.
Which are mitigations and
It
could go high, lower, it could go higher.
Right. Well, it can't be higher than the actual value of the over contribution. But and under this scenario, it could be lower.
So we're talking about a bureaucratic process or administrative process. This is not a policy change of any kind.
The policy change is already in effect, and
Yeah.
that is to say enforcement will handle this,
Yeah.
not audit.
Okay.
So that's already done. So this is just setting out how we're going to go about doing that.
What this policy also does is impose fines, not just the forfeitures, but also impose fines against the person who violates the law.
So
Depending, I'm sorry.
Like I say, if I understand it correctly, what you're standardizing it and saying that, let's assume we're talking first-time violation. If somebody, some campaigns accepts a contribution in excess of the maximum allowable, that they forfeit automatically within 5 days. You tell them you violated it, and then they've got a fairly brief period of time to either try and show you they didn't violate it, or to, and on first-time violations, you'll impose a fine of $2,500, I think. It depended, but there was a set fine that gets imposed, and then there is some discretionary procedure if they want to say they're mitigating circumstances, or you think there's aggravating circumstances. Those two can weigh each other, right?
That is correct, yes.
But it would be something fairly, wouldn't require any great process from the point of view of the staff. It's simply, once you find out, or once you're satisfied there's been an excess contribution, what happens after that is just spelled out.
Pretty much so, yes.
Yeah. And what you pointed out that I left out is, up to this point, we just took the excess amount as the penalty.
Right.
Going forward, we're going to do that, but then assess penalty, a fine on top of the penalty, if you will.
Mm-hmm. I understand that.
Any public comment?
Hi, my name is Erica Boyd. I'm from the Sutton Law Firm. I want to thank staff for putting forward these proposals. I know it always takes a lot of time. The first issue we had is, I know you talked about this a lot in 2008, but that these came forward on July 17th, which I believe was last Thursday, and so there hasn't been any interested persons meeting since then to discuss this specific interpretation and enforcement of the policy. So we would ask that because it is such a big issue, that there are at least 1 or 2 interested persons meetings. Additionally, at that time in 2008, also we had meetings with the California Political Treasurers Association and the California Political Attorneys Association. So we would ask that those groups are contacted as well to at least give their feedback on this enforcement procedures. To begin with, as someone already mentioned, the 5 days in the policy to respond to a possible violation is a very short time period, I think, especially in the midst of a campaign or while something is going on. If someone's out of the office for 2 days and they miss the letter, if the address is wrong on the letter, the 5 days could go by so quickly. The FPPC's current policy is 14 days to respond. The FEC's policy is 30 days. So we would ask that at the very least it mirror the FPPC's policy of 14 days and possibly longer. We understand this is a process where you're trying to get through violations quickly, but we would appreciate the longer time there as well. And also to take into account that sometimes it's not a black and white issue. It's not easily seen that somebody gave $500 at one point and $100 later on. Maybe the campaign stretched over a year and a half and they didn't even realize that they had written out that check. So giving both the donor and the campaign a chance to kind of rectify that situation would be appreciated as well. We also have a bit of a due process question in regards to the automatic forfeiture of the contribution to the city. I understand completely that in situations where a candidate or a committee was not supposed to take a contribution, they should not benefit from that contribution. But we believe instead of the money automatically going to the city, it should be going back to the contributor. We would ask that possibly have a city attorney opinion on that, given that it could have implications for a due process clause. And then the last part we wanted to address was the disclaimer violations. And looking at the list of the mitigating and aggregating factors, one of the ways that staff was going to go about it was just doing an automatic 5% increase or decrease. But in looking at this list of factors, an absence of any intention to conceal should not have the same weight as evidence of an intent to conceal. That in and of itself is trying to get around the laws. And so, if anything, we think there should be more of a totality of the circumstances test that staff will take into account as opposed to a straight across the board, and taking into account if there's no public harm in the violation.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Any further public comment? Mr. St. Croix, any reaction to those comments?
Well, I think we could probably have some give on the turnaround time. You know, I don't see an issue with extending that amount of time to the, 14 or 15 days there. But beyond that, I think the rest of it's pretty straightforward. So I'm not convinced we need to delay this to get additional impact. This is pretty basic stuff.
And am I correct in understanding that the forfeiture provision is statutory? It's not something the commission has come up with. That's what it provides. If somebody accepts a contribution in excess, it is forfeited.
Correct.
So that the due process question that was raised has been resolved in the statute, and I assume if there's been litigation, it's been resolved in litigation. But I mean, we aren't creating the automatic forfeiture. That's just enforcing the statute.
Right.
Again, I would venture to say this is really an administrative and bureaucratic process and not really a policy issue. I assume that there have been opportunities for the public to comment on this and to provide their point of view.
Well, this proposal is not, hasn't, the public got it at the same time you got it. So just a few days.
So what is your reaction to having an interested parties meeting?
I think it's kind of basic stuff. I don't know that we need a lot of input on something like this. This is, our making administrative decisions of how we're going to handle something.
Any other commission comments?
So there were 3 points, right? So 2 of the 3 we've kind of sort of resolved. Is that not correct? Well, 2 of the 3. One is in consideration, for like 5 business days to possibly 14 days or 15 days.
I don't have a problem with that.
And then the other is basically a statute, and all we're doing is following.
Right.
I would say, however, that the staff raised, when we get to factors of mitigation and aggravation, raised 2 options. One would be a option which left no discretion really in the staff, and the other option was one where they could consider them without being restricted as opposed in one. And I would be I know the staff probably would prefer the first. I would prefer the second, because I think some of the factors clearly are much more important than others.
Okay.
Do we need a motion to approve this?
Yeah. So it would be a motion to approve these recommendations with the change, if you wish to move it to, let's say, do we want to say 14 days, 10 business days?
Yes, 14 days.
14 days. Assuming you want that to change to 14 days, and then using the second consideration option where we would present to the commission rather than leave it to staff.
Yeah, that's a great motion. I make a motion that we accept the changes in the enforcement and settlement and penalties with the change of 5 business days to 14 days. Is it 10 business
No,
days?
just say 14 days, that'll be 2 weeks.
14 days. And that we would accept the second scenario by which the staff would present this to the commission for consideration. Violation.
Seconded.
Any further discussion?
Can I just make 2 comments? One is on page 3, after number 1, on the second line, instead of saying a violation of any part of section 1.114, it should say a violation of section 1.114A1, B, or E. And then on page 4, also after number 1, second line, instead of saying a violation of any part of section 1.114, it should say a violation of section 1.114A1 or 1.114A2.
Thank you. Any further public comment? All in favor of the motion?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay.
Can I ask a question of the staff? Because if a individual makes a contribution to a campaign in excess of that allowed under the code, does that individual also face penalties?
Before now, no. After now, yes.
Okay. That's the way I read it, and I didn't know whether that was intended.
Okay, so for our next item, there's been some interest by the commissioners, particularly Commissioner Rennie, on revisiting the idea of reports by expenditure lobbyists who do not directly lobby government officials about governmental decisions, but rather make expenditures that would influence people outside of government to in turn try to influence governmental decisions. The most obvious is doing outreach to the public via various media, advertising, whatever, to try to get them to contact elected officials or city officials regarding pending decisions. When we move the lobbyist program online, we change the focus from entities to individuals. And as part of that discussion, the capturing of expenditure lobbyists was essentially deleted from our process. There aren't that many expenditure lobbying actions in the course of a year. There were a total of 8 in the last 3 years that we tracked them. Nonetheless, this is people spending money to influence governmental decisions. So we don't have legislation drafted yet, but we have a basis for what we think the Commission might like to do to recapture this sort of reporting. And so this recommendation is because the expenditure lobbyists don't really shoehorn well into the existing lobbyist reporting program, we would create a new category outside of the electronic system. Basic, simple reporting. When you make the expenditures, you report it to us. We put it online. But we wanted to make sure this is a direction acceptable to the Commission before we drafted the legislation that has to go through the board.
Commissioners, how do you feel about that?
Was there a penalty built into that? I was reading through it, and I wanted to see what happens when there's a failure to.
Well, the standard rules in the Campaign Governmental Conduct Code, et cetera, will apply. In general, it's fines are up to $5,000 or 3 times the amount of the infraction, whatever the Commission determines is. So that language will be built into the legislation. Okay. But it will reflect the standard that we use in enforcement actions.
Does Does this make sense to you, Commissioner Rennie, in terms of, is this acceptable to you in terms of what you had brought up previously?
Let me just say, I'm disappointed that there's no public comment here, because certainly my inquiry was in some ways initiated by Mr. Bush's article, in which he made it sound as if there were great sums of money that were being focused into the political process and no reporting requirements, and that by taking out the expenditure lobbyist provision, that we were sort of not giving the public information. Well, I had hoped that he would be here when this item was on the agenda so he could articulate to me and to the commission what is the problem that he thinks we should be addressing. Because I agree with what Mr. St. Croix has said, that there really were only 2 or 3 reports. But as I understood what Mr. Bush claimed in his article, is that was sort of the tip of the iceberg, and there were great amounts of money being spent behind the scenes to control the political process. So I have no problem with what the staff has discussed, and I guess the question is whether there is a need for it, and whether it's something that we feel needs to be addressed because the public is being deprived of relevant information as to expenditures that are being made.
And again, 8 over period, 8
Of 3 years.
over 3 years.
Well, let me ask if there is any public comment on this item.
Right now, if somebody doing business with the city makes a contribution, say, to a charitable organization, which is sort of a pet project of a supervisor, is there any reporting requirement?
If the contribution is a result of urging from that supervisor or other elected official, state law requires the filing of what we call a behest form.
Right.
So anytime a private entity makes a contribution that was generated in some form by influence of an elected official, they have to file this.
But it has to be sort of initiated by the public official, as opposed to somebody who is doing his homework and saying, what are the charitable organizations that Supervisor X is closely involved with, and I'm going to make contributions to them. There isn't any requirement then that they.
No, if you're, and I believe that the state is kind of looking at this, where, and I don't know how far along it is, where anyone doing business with this city that makes charitable contributions in excess of, is it $5,000? We'll have to report them as a matter of course.
Regardless of whether anyone urged them to do it.
Right.
Otherwise, at this time, it is the elected official who has to make the report.
Yeah, right.
And if somebody doing business with the city wants to fund a community campaign to create public support for a issue which may be before the voters, that funding of that campaign is not reported?
That's right, and that's kind of what this proposal would attempt to capture.
But that aspect is, does that cover, for example, an organization that has a project, has a big campaign, and that is endorsed by an elected official. Does that count? I mean, elected officials endorse all kinds of programs and projects all the time.
I'd say that it could, if they were using an elected official's imprimatur to add legitimacy to their appeal to the public.
You mean if they used it, for example, in printed material
Yeah.
or a media campaign?
Yeah, let's say we're doing a mailer to, say, write to the Board of Supervisors and tell them not to cut funding for firehouses, keep them all open. Maybe the firefighters union would do something like that. And they would say, Supervisors X and Y are spearheading a movement to help us, gain the funding we need. Please write or call the board right away. That reporting would be captured whether or not the supervisors' names were attached to it or not. But it's kind of, that wouldn't be, it's not associated with like a ballot measure or something, so there's no actual political reporting attached to it.
I see.
Does that answer your question?
I think it does, yeah.
Which basically seems to be the same thing as endorsed. I was thinking of more of firehouse number 9, let's say firehouse number 9, and there's a particular initiative or some ballot measure that's endorsed by these candidates already. And then you list those candidates who've endorsed this particular initiative to say firehouse number 9. That would fall within this as well.
If it gets tricky if we're within a certain range before an election, anything that contains candidates' names kind of becomes election material, and therefore will be regulated differently. I think a good example, and I hope I construct this correctly, was there was a Prop F a few years ago about firehouses. Before Prop F came into existence, there was a campaign to get the board not to put it on the ballot, not to create a ballot measure. So the initial spending on this was to put up, I think, billboards and send out mailings telling the public, tell the Board of Supervisors we don't want funding cuts. And when it looked like the cuts were coming anyway, then a ballot measure was created to rescind those cuts, which moved into the realm of being regulated as an election item. But before that point, it would have been expenditure lobbying because they were going directly to the public. It wasn't associated with a candidate or a ballot measure.
If there's an initiative on the ballot and some individual wants to finance robocalls, does he or she have to report the fact that robocalls that are going to call people saying, vote for this initiative?
Yeah, but that's not considered lobbying. That's electioneering.
But that would, you'd have to report it.
Yeah, they have to report it as independent expenditures.
Yeah, right. Okay.
In which case it is campaign finance reporting. So that's already captured.
So at this time, what is necessary is to actually write the language that can be incorporated into the proposed legislation at the Board of Supervisors.
Yeah. So if you like this direction, you just need to indicate to us, go ahead and go forward and draft the proper legislation. We'll bring that back to you for your approval when it's drafted, and then we'll send it over to the board. But we don't need a formal approval of this.
I wanted to hear from the other commissioners on the preponderance. Are we taking that into consideration? After Mr. Bush brought this to our attention and believed that it was the tip of the iceberg, and then we find after an investigation and some research that it's 8 over 3 years. I wanted to hear from the other commissioners what your thought was. Is that a tipping point? Is that is it statistically significant in any way? Does it have bearing on what we're getting ready to move forward with one way or another?
I guess I would I just throw this out, have the minutes reflect that this subject came up, that there was no public comment, and that therefore, absent that, there does not appear to be a need under the present reporting requirements. And if somebody wants to come bring it back, I would
I'd be happy to
look at
entertain
it, but I don't know why we want the staff to deal with a problem that the public apparently is not concerned about.
And then we'll have an additional opportunity to discuss this issue when the language comes back to us at the next meeting, before we send it off to the Board of Supervisors.
Well, do you want us to go forward and draft that?
I think we do, yes,
Okay.
absolutely.
All right.
I think we all agree
Okay.
with that.
So we're going to do that. We don't need any formal action.
Very good. So let's look at the minutes from the last meeting. Are there any additions or corrections? I believe that was your first meeting with Commissioner Andrews.
Indeed it was. And my name spelled right, so that's great.
Thank you.
That's
Are you
essential.
going to frame this?
Absolutely essential.
The first and the last. I make a motion.
Seconded.
Approve minutes.
Any public comment on the minutes? Hearing none. All in favor of approving the minutes?
Aye.
Aye. The minutes stand approved. And want to consider the executive director's report.
So my major highlight, obviously, is the budget. The mayor hasn't signed it yet, so we're still not through the woods, if you will, but the indications are good. So this bodes very well for us. The delay in hiring an education outreach coordinator continues because the city won't let us hire someone until they have an approved list. The list, I'm told, now exists and will be distributed to us in the very near future. So we will be in recruiting from that.
So we can only recruit from the list?
Right. We had an auditor retire, and until that person's exhausted their vacation, we can't begin looking for a replacement. So that's coming up. And this funding will allow us to hire another investigator, which will be good. So we'll be able to do, the current investigators are doing exceptionally good work, but this will allow them to concentrate on fewer cases at a time and bring resolution in a better fashion. So that's actually very, very good news. That's my only real highlight. The other thing that I would just point out is 15 non-filers were referred to the FPPC of statements of economic interest. This is out of 600 or 700 filers, and normally we have 60 or 70 non-filers a year. So we've done a good job this year, in spite of the fact that the responsibilities for this were transferred mid-year from one staff to another. So I'm actually very pleased with that number, and wanted to point that out to you. And then if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Commissioners, any questions?
I just wanted to hear from Mr. St. Croix. A caseload, do you have an optimum kind of caseload per investigator that you would be going for? I suspect at this moment it's higher than you would prefer it to be.
I don't have an actual number because we don't really have any control over that. Mm-hmm. We have the number of cases divided by the number of staff, tempered with the volume of each individual case. And with 2 investigators, it balances very well. I have no issues I have no problem thinking that it'll be fine with 3. I would say in an ideal world, somebody balancing between 3 and 5 cases is enough. Maybe 3 is probably too low, 5 or 6, because you move forward and then you have to wait for stuff to move forward. Several of our investigations are pending audits, and the audit staff moves at a different pace. And at any given time, we have 30 to 50 cases. The number of cases coming in is a lot greater, but a lot of them are dismissals. And you've seen many of those for various reasons, mostly of non-jurisdiction. But I couldn't tell you ideally what it is, because we've never lived in an ideal world.
We're getting closer.
The Emerald City is closer than ever.
Okay.
Oh, I'm certainly glad to hear that. Any items for future meetings?
Public comment on the ED report, sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Public comment on the executive director's report. Hearing none, we'll move on to any proposed items for future meetings. Add to the agenda. All right. And finally, is there any other public comment on matters appearing or not appearing on the agenda tonight? We appreciate those of you who were here to provide public comment. Thank you. And that concludes.
Move we adjourn.
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
That adjourns the meeting of the Ethics Commission.